Mr. President. I've got his CV here. I'm not going to read it all. I'm not going to embarrass you, Bruce. But it's interesting, he joined his fire service before some of our senior officers in the room actually were born. No, before they joined the fire service. No. He joined the Phoenix Fire Department in 1967 and was promoted through the ranks of Deputy Chief in 1985. He served as the Fire Chief in Carrollton,
Yes.
in Texas from 1992 to 2004 before becoming the Fire Chief in Santa Rosa in California. And his fire service experience includes administration, operation, communication, safety, airport operations, training, fire prevention and investigations. He retired in 2010 and has since focused on providing fire service training and roadway traffic incident management classes throughout the United States, whilst also serving as a health and safety advisor for the Avondale Fire and Medical Fire Department. He's an active individual still within the fire sector, and he's a member of the Arizona Fire Chiefs Association, California Fire Chiefs, Western Fire Chiefs, California State Firefighters Association, the NFPA, and a number of other Chief Fire Officers Associations. And he's a fellow of the Institution of Fire Engineers. And prior to the election to the board, Bruce was the International General Assembly rep for the United States branch and continues as branch manager. Bruce flew in late last night after a 5-hour delay. I think you might have caught up on his sleep.
A little bit, yeah.
But Bruce is halfway through his presidential year, and he's already travelled through many of the international branches, and he's an advocate for the IFE, and we welcome you to Scotland, Bruce.
Thank you very much. Could you come up for just a moment? One of the things that I've done as I've traveled around is presented the president of the branch that was kind enough to invite me with just a small memento. This is a challenge coin. It's a presidential challenge coin that we tried to start a tradition. We'll see whether the tradition holds, but I'd like to present you with this
Wow.
coin, and thank you very much for hosting me
No
and
problem at
inviting me
all.
to be here today.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's interesting to listen to the things that are going on in your branch and recognize a lot of the similarities that are going on within branches in the U.S. and some of the other branches around the world. Struggling with content, struggling with bringing members in, struggling with keeping people engaged are a common theme. People are busy, so we see that is ongoing. So it's like sitting in a U.S. board meeting where I still serve on the board there, with some very similar discussions. I loved your presentation on the demographics. That was very, very good. Today we're going to talk about, I've been asked to talk about an event that occurred. Fortunately, I was no longer the fire chief in Santa Rosa at the time it occurred. I've had people say, "Well, you missed it," and I said, "Yes, I'm really happy that I missed it," because the ultimate loss was approximately 1/6 of the city. And when we look at wildfire, we'll talk about that a little bit more as it's going on around the world. But the wildfires are named based on a location generally where they started. The Tubbs fire, which burned into the city of Santa Rosa between October 9 and 11th, the total fires in that entire complex going on to 31 October in 2017. Deadliest and most destructive in the state of California's history until the following year when the town of Paradise was completely destroyed with a wildfire. As we look at things that occurred, they were immensely predictable. And we'll talk about a previous fire and where that fire burned. When I went to Santa Rosa, I did not have any extensive heavy fuel experience. I'd been in places where we had grass fires. So lightweight fires, which are really, really dangerous fires because they move very, very quickly. But they talk about 1 hour, 3 hour, 5 hour fuels, which are these big trees, really big trees. At a Cal Fire Battalion Chief that was retired, and I went to a meeting together, and I got to ride in the car with him, and he was asking me about my experience. And I told him I didn't have very much, and he says, well, son, it's like this. Fire burns uphill a lot faster than it burns downhill, and if it's burning downhill fast, you're in a heap of caca. I said, good to know. So when we look at this, the principal part of the city of Santa Rosa that burned was Fountain Grove. It's a community within Santa Rosa, and they had taken the efforts to be a Firewise community, which is an NFPA program in preparing your community for the potential of wildland fires. They took it very seriously. They were actively engaged. The fire department was actively engaged with them in this endeavor. I went to a number of meetings as the fire chief on this very topic, but it's designed to be self-run by the community. Now, while we had identified the site, we went through a lot of the preliminaries for a fire station up in that same area. That fire station wasn't actually completed until after I had retired, but we'll also talk about that. Spanish for Santa Rosa, which is Spanish for St. Rose. It's north of San Francisco. It's the largest city between San Francisco and Portland, Oregon on the west coast. It's the Sonoma wine country, which is separated by one little small range of mountains from the better known Napa wine country, which a lot of people venture to both of them over time. And it's just a very, very beautiful place in non-fire season. Santa Rosa Fire Department was established as a fully paid fire department in 1894. 138 members. Fire Chief Tony Gosner, I had the privilege to promote him a couple of times when I was the fire chief there. Is a really good guy, solid citizen, and grew up in the community. He's very, very ingrained in the community. Very good people. Fountain Grove, it talks a little bit about, this is tourist brochure obviously, but it talks about the promising future. It's upscale housing. I don't think there was a house anywhere in Santa Rosa going for under about $1.5 million US for the low-end housing. So it went rapidly upward from there. Golf course, lots of amenities within the community. Firewise, we talked about that. It's an organization. It's planning. It's doing it. It's sharing that with other communities. What you have done. It's making sure that your distances are met. It's making sure that the fire can't burn up to the structure. There's reduction in fuels, keeping them clean. There's another neighborhood that's just down the road about 2 miles from Fountain Grove that I met with a couple of times while I was the chief fire officer in Santa Rosa. And I told them, I said, if you have a significant fire in this area, we cannot protect your dwellings because you have chosen not to do some of the things that we consider essential. When the fire swept through Santa Rosa, that neighborhood did not burn. So fire does some interesting things. It will take structures, and right next door, the structure will look as if it had never been even exposed to fire. Mother Nature does some very interesting things. In 1964, the Hanley fire burned into the city of Santa Rosa. It started in almost exactly the same place as the Tubbs fire. Over a period of 4 days, it burned into the city. There was a stand taken by citizens, by the fire department, by some of the farmers in the area that kept it from burning significantly into the city of Santa Rosa. Many of the places that it burned did not have structures at that time. And when the Tubbs fire occurred, there were structures there. So it was a lot more buildup. The Tubbs fire took 4 hours to cover the same distances. Wind conditions, humidity conditions, all factors that come into this. Terrain is another extreme factor. A part of this complex of fires was a neighborhood in Santa Rosa called Coffee Park. Coffee Park is just as flat as these tabletops. There's no terrain involved. They don't have significant trees in the neighborhood. They have normal neighborhood trees. But the wind conditions were such on that night that the wind was sustained at 60 to 65 miles an hour with recorded gusts up to 90. The fire spotted across Highway 101, got into some grassland, into some construction materials, and a wind-driven fire burned through most of Coffee Park. There's a GIS map that you can actually see where sufficient resources got there to cut off that fire. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but we do have a couple of pictures of it. But that was incidental to the terrain, to the issues of a heavy fuel wildland fire going on in Fountain Grove at exactly the same time. There were also other fires going on across the state. California has one of the most extensive mutual aid automatic aid systems in the United States. What it doesn't do very well, although they've made some improvements since this fire, is change the direction of units that are already sent. The fire started in Napa County, and they asked for additional resources. Those resources were immediately sent. So as the fire burned into Sonoma County, he received notification, and he drove up to one of the high points in Fountain Grove, and he's looking back at the glow coming across the ridge lines. And he said to himself, says, we're in serious trouble. They initiated recalls of all off-duty personnel. They asked for the additional assistance through the Office of Emergency Management. So they did the things that were necessary for them to...
I've got it now.
There we go. And sounds like we lost our audio in the process. That's all right. We'll stay with the video. The audio. Ken Porter is, like I said, he's a reporter for the Press Democrat. He's a really good reporter. He's a lifetime resident of the community, and very, very active in his reporting for the newspaper. And he does the video portion, which many of the newspapers have added video today. So he is actually out moving through the community, catching these videos. These are all houses. So as you can see, he put himself at risk as he was doing this. He's very, very familiar with the roads, with the area. He's very well known to law enforcement and to emergency services. So he had an ability to move around. And this is Sky Farm Drive, which is on the upper end of Fountain Grove. Interestingly, Round Barn was a historic round barn that was kind of a entryway key. There were also two hotels, a Hilton and the Fountain Grove Inn, which was a very high-end hotel, and they were lost. Interestingly enough, the name Trails End Mobile Home Park was across the road from those. 80% of the Trails End met the end of the trail. So as you can see, the wind conditions that are pushing this fire. So you have brands that are extending, in some cases, more than a mile out ahead of the fire, starting additional fires. We had put in a roadway while I was there as the chief. A roadway had been put in that was connecting the Fountain Grove area over to Mark West Springs, which is a well-known roadway that goes up to Calistoga. And one of the things they put in is they put in plastic culverts underneath the road. These culverts got debris blown into them. The plastic ignited and burned and collapsed portions of the roadway. So you have large 10, 12, 14-inch plastic culverts underneath the roadway that were burned is a part of this. That is an exercise in futility. Part of structure protection principles are an analysis of whether or not you can actually protect the structure. And unfortunately, firefighters really want to do that, and if there's any sense that they can, they will try to do it, and many times to our own detriment in that process. And we've seen that recently in Australia as well. These are roads that I had driven. I was very familiar with. I had driven very regularly. As the fire chief, I didn't live there. I lived in a low-rent condominium down in town. But did admire, and there was a particular house that was for sale for a large portion of the time, the 7 years that I worked there. And I was recently back in Santa Rosa, and I said, you know, I've just got to drive by and see. No, it was gone. It was one of the ones that was gone. So we can go ahead and shut the video off and go back to the slides. I apologize for the lack of the audio there, but that does give you a sense of what was going on that night in that very compressed time frame. So here we are a full 3 years later. Recovery is still a long ways off, full recovery from this event. When we look at, it says a housing development in a rural area that had been built to the highest fire safety standards, vegetation cleared, homes built of fire resistant materials. How does that get reduced to the ashes by the Tubbs fire? So how did it wipe out a complete community? Well, I think the answer is that, first of all, the fire-resistant materials is very well known here in the UK, with events over the last few years are not always quite as fire-resistant as advertised. When you face the right conditions, they're definitely not as fire-resistant as advertised. There's a real reevaluation of the necessary clearance distances, what those should actually be in order to keep fire from being able to burn into structures. What types of flame fronts are produced under what kind of conditions. We've had some tremendous examples of that in Australia over the past couple of months. You can build fire-resistant structures. This is in Laguna, California. This was in about 1992. This gentleman was a structural engineer with a fire protection background, and he designed his house to withstand fire. He absolutely put the efforts and the materials into designing that house so that it could withstand a fire. And he later said he wished he hadn't done it because he became the little house on the prairie. Not so little, but. A recent article, when I was doing some looking, talked about 6 levels of brush fire exposure from low to flame zone. and the highest category of that being characteristics that allow a structure to survive that fire coming right across it. $213,000 for the windows for that structure as they costed it out on that design. There are certainly other designs that probably don't cost as much, but the trade-offs become just that. They become the trade-offs for what you can and can't do. I talked to a fire captain that I know fairly well that was on a strike team in Southern California, and they came across a house, and they were assigned structure protection, and they came across a house, and the engineer had a 25,000 gallon tank. He had 2 deluge guns that were remotely operated using IR sensors to protect his structure. He spent as much on that protection as he did on the house. But he could keep a fire from moving into his house at the upper end of the canyon, where that fire burning uphill is going to burn fast. There is a NASA site that's quite significant, and it looks at fires around the world. It goes back to 2006. This is actually from October 2017. This snapshot, and as you can see, we have a little bit of orange in Northern California, which would have been the Tubbs fire. And you can also see what's going on across the rest of the world. South America, Central Africa, Australia, the former Soviet Union states, all the K states. So when we look at wildfire across the world, it becomes very significant. And you don't think much of Scotland for wildfire. This is off the web. This is mostly 2017, 2018. 2018 recorded 4 times higher than 2017 for wildfires in Scotland. Moray, one of the largest fires, and I'm sure there's some members of the fire service in here that can tell us about some of these fires. I don't know much about them other than what I pulled off the web and some of the photographs. I will say that if your wildfires are going to increase, you need to look at different kit for the firefighters that are out there, because structural kit will hurt you over time. And what's going on in Australia? And Australia is continuing. As we look, this is the prediction for February 1st in New South Wales. So, hush. Told you I'd keep on time. When we look at the number of fires going on across the country, far greater threats than what were going on in Napa. It was the next level of resources that were then coming, so it took longer for them to get them. The Tubbs fire, unfortunately, occurred at night, which adds to the issues. There had been a lot of work over the years to improve the alerting systems to the public, and we weren't successful in improving those to the degree that we would like. While I was there as the chief fire officer, in the ensuing few years after that, we still weren't successful. Today, those have been significantly changed as a direct result of that fire. 38,000 acres and the loss of 22 lives. People that simply couldn't get out. Literally hundreds of people that got out because of their neighbors, because of the work of law enforcement, because of the work of firefighters, that went through extraordinary efforts to wake them up, get them away from the fire. I mentioned the Hanley fire, it's outlined in red. The Tubbs fire is outlined in black. Fuels, humidity, terrain. It burned the same area. And in about 40 years, it will probably burn through the same area again. Maybe less, maybe a few more. But we can look historically at areas, particularly in California, because we have really good records where this has occurred. And it's interesting to watch where you try to make, as emergency services, suggestions for change. Although these suggestions for change would widen roads, thus reducing people's property. They would take away some people's property in order to make things safer. The fire in Oakland, California, Oakland Hills fire, is a prime example where it's been rebuilt almost exactly as it was prior to the Oakland Hills fire. And again, when we as professionals are addressing and trying to convince people that if we make these changes, we will make it safer, it comes down to cost. It comes down to, well, my neighbor can do that, but I'm not going to do that. So we do see some of those changes as well. This is looking at the fire for the Santa Rosa area. Santa Rosa runs from Roseland to Wickiup. This would be approximately the total area of Santa Rosa. If we look at the buildings that were destroyed, each of those red dots represents a structure. And as I talked about Coffey Park, this area here, again, this is flat ground and strictly wind-driven fire. A lot of these smaller dots that we see up in here are pretty rurally located. Concentration in Fountain Grove community and Larkfield community are communities that are built in the wildland urban interface. But when we take a look at what happened, and you can see the difference between these two maps in terms of what's there and what's not there on the right-hand side is Keysight Technologies, the tanks. This is Fountain Grove Parkway. This is the residential areas here. You can see all the houses that were there that are no longer visible on the updated map. There's active rebuilding going on every day. They're rebuilding houses. We look at the before and after. Google Maps, exact same location. The right would be before and the left after the fire. Would you click that for me? We'll probably not run this video to its full length. This was shot by a reporter in Australia. When we look at the major brush fires going on in New South Wales, which has taken the brunt of these fires, and when we look at how big it is, and here's a comparison to what's burned to the UK. That's astounding. And if you have that much fire burning in the UK, you don't have the resources. They don't have the resources. New South Wales is the largest fire department in the world, predominantly volunteers, being reinforced with career firefighters from across the country and indeed across the globe, aerial resources coming from around the world. This was, the Twitter was this morning, so it was 14 hours old, talking about there are currently 62 brush and grass fires burning in New South Wales, 29 of which do not have any containment. That was this morning. It's not a New Zealand, Australia, US, Australia, California problem, which they get the majority of the publicity. It's a world problem. The consequences are global. This is one of those where act locally and think globally has to come into play. And when we look at the fires that are occurring across the world, we look at the losses, both economic and human losses. It is an area where we have got to pay more attention to. Thank you for letting me do this. Thank you for your hospitality and the opportunity to be here with you.
I can't deceive and knock you out. It's absolutely not done fine. So I just want to say thank you for that. That was completely out of the blue. I really appreciate that. On behalf of everybody here, really appreciated hearing your stories, your story there about the wildfires. I think it means a lot to a lot of us in our line of work. We see that, and I think we do take it for granted that it might be on the other side of the world, but it does affect all of us. So just a token appreciation gesture. Thank you. It was very, very much appreciated.
Thank you so
I hope
very
you
much.
enjoy it, because it's a good tune. And I hope if it doesn't get into the suitcase, well, that's good, but if it's going back with you, then I hope it gets in the suitcase.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. With that, it is tea break time.